Hi guys, welcome back to 30 Days to Your First Website Design, a Touch Plus premium course. I'm Ian Yates, and today we're going to look a little further into HTML and semantics. We'll begin as always by taking a quick look at what we're going to cover in this video. We're firstly going to define semantics. We'll then look at some examples of what semantics are and what they're not. Then we'll complete our own documents markup, adhering to the rules we discuss. Finally, after some further reading, and before we jump into the next video, I'll ask you to complete an assignment. Now, the word semantic with regard to HTML is used to refer to the meaning of the markup used. These days, with the arrival of HTML5 syntax, we can use elements such as nav to denote navigational elements of the site, whereas previously we might have just used a div with the class of nav. We also have footer, which you'll have seen in our web markup. Previously we might have used a div with the ID of footer, perfectly understandable for whoever wrote it, but not a recognizable standard. Having more semantic elements at our disposal allows us to more clearly describe the contents of our web pages. Remember the standards model we talked about in the last video? The separation of structure, styling and behavior? Well, using semantics with our markup simply helps us to give fundamental meaning to our HTML without having to visually describe it. Semantics further aid the accessibility of our document. Screen readers don't use the styling we define, so by explaining them with markup what each area of the page is for, screen readers can better interpret what they're looking at. Semantics also help to clean things up, as the two examples I've given you suggest. Now, it's worth noticing that practicing semantics doesn't just apply to the elements you use, it can also go as far as the selectors, the classes, the IDs that you define. Take this for example. An H2 heading tag with a class of red, or a div with a class of left. You might think these are fine, and you might come across them in examples you find on the web, but actually in assigning identifiers like these, you're tangling up the structure and the presentation again. Who's to say that this left div won't be positioned at the right of the page in the future? You might then have a CSS rule which looks a bit like this, which would be utter nonsense. Keep your selector names semantic. Describe what you're building, not how it might appear. Okay, so that's covered the meaning of semantics. Let's now finish off our markup as semantically as possible. Let's exit first our presentation and we'll jump back into Coda where we have our index.html waiting for us. It will all look fairly familiar to you. I haven't changed anything in the meantime, but I have made some additions to the style CSS, which I can demonstrate to you now by opening Google Chrome. Here is our page in its current state. As promised, I've added styling to the logo. I have just polished up the primary navigation, and I added a bit of styling to the navigation for our slideshow. Now, these links don't actually do anything yet because, as I mentioned, these are going to be added dynamically using the jQuery plugin, which will power our slideshow there. So if you refer to the styles, I'm not going to go through the whole thing because I'm afraid we just don't have time. Logo is built with just a couple of groups of rules here, the H1 and the anchor within that H1. Primary navigation isn't much more complex. Notably, the primary nav, which is the unordered list containing our navigation there. If we just refer back to Google Chrome and I inspect the element, you will see that this UL element here has been neatly positioned in the top right hand corner of its containing wrapper. Lastly, there was the slider navigation. Again, very simple. Each one of those little buttons is simply an anchor which has had its text indented way beyond the boundaries of the link itself, and it has a background using our sprite. So that's all perfectly clear. The slide nav, which is the containing div, is the width of the whole page, and you can see it has a text aligned centrally so that all of those little links sit neatly in the middle of our page. Okay, now back to the point of this exercise. We're going to add the missing elements, all the markup that we need to add. And if we refer to our PSD, we can see that we're talking about these 3 columns here, 2 larger columns in our contact area, and the information in the footer here. Now for our 3 columns within our team area here, we might normally have used a div for each one. We're actually going to be concentrating more on the semantics, so where a more semantic element is available, it's advisable to use it. We're therefore going to go for an article tag. So let's find our team. That's here. We're going to stick 3 article tags in here. Now an article is can be described as a sort of independent chunk of information. If you can imagine it going into your RSS feeder, for example, and you don't need any other information around it to describe what's going on, then that is worthy of being an article. In our case, we have, for example, an image, a header, and a paragraph. And you can imagine that if you were to remove everything else around here, you'd have enough information within this article to understand what's going on. Now I have actually prepared some markup here in order to just speed things up, because we're running against the clock, I'm afraid. So having placed this article here, I'm just going to replace it with slightly more elaborate markup. You can see I've given it a class of subcol that's going to be used to define the dimensions and the fact that it is one of 3 columns floating to the left, and this simply identifies it as the first of those columns. Each one has an image there with its alternative text, the header, and the relevant text. So I'm just going to paste the additional 2 articles in there so we can crack on. And there they are. You can see here within our wrapper we have our 3 articles, 1, 2, 3, and each one contains the relevant information. I'll save that. I'll just jump back into Google Chrome here and refresh the page, and you can see there the 3 columns relatively unstyled. Excellent. Now let's move on to our contact area. Again, 2 columns, each one of which contains a header. So let's just punch those in here. These are in our contacts section. So again, I'm going to copy and paste some of this, I'm afraid. Firstly, I'm going to use a div to contain that instead of an article. I'll just finish off that as I advised in a previous video. So that takes care of the header and the paragraph underneath. Now we need to add an image. Now this is going to be our Google map as shown here. Now we can either use, we could embed an elaborate JavaScript widget here, that's one option. We could go and copy and slice our own image, but you can actually relatively easily grab a dynamic static image from the Google with the Google API. This is the documentation here. Just go and Google static maps from Google and you'll find it. All you need to do is generate a path which will go to the Google server, and it will pull back an image depending on the attributes you use. You can determine the markers, the zoom level, the positioning, or all kinds of things. It's fantastic. So if I just jump back into Coda here, I'm going to quickly paste in the path that I have generated. I've gone for the easy option, and I've basically determined where our marker is going to be. This is our marker here with a color which I've pulled, the hex value which I've pulled from our PSD, given it a label of E, which I'm actually going to change. I'll give it S for smile, it's much better. And then I've determined where that is using the Envato headquarters street address. Perfectly simple. You can also determine the dimensions of your image there, and this sensor false just indicates that I don't have any kind of GPS geolocating jiggery pokery going on. I'm actually defining the location myself. So if I save that and jump back into Google Chrome and refresh the page, you'll see that it's pulled a perfect image from the Google servers. Excellent. So let's go back to our PSD. We had the address details underneath. Now, just two quick divs with our address details underneath there. Oh, not Chrome, where we go in Coda. So there's our image, and I'll just paste those two divs with a couple of paragraphs underneath. Now in the adjacent column we've got our form. I'm just going to copy and paste that in as well. There we go. Here's our second div, also with the class of col, with col2 identifying it there. The header, just the same as always. This opens up our form here, and you can see 3 paragraphs containing labels with various inputs. This first one has a label with a class of error. This is again going to be generated dynamically using our form validation script, but for the meantime I'm going to add it statically so we can style it properly when the time comes. And it ends with a button at the bottom. Just checking our PSD, that kind of takes care of everything there, which leaves us with just this footer. So we need to put in our footer a paragraph and 3 social links, which is fairly straightforward. I'll go and grab the paragraph, find our footer, which you'll now recognize as being very semantic, perfect, within the wrapper there, and there's that copyright paragraph. And lastly, I just wanted an unordered list, which I'm going to give a class of social. Neatly end it as so, and then I'm going to add 3 list elements. I'll give that an empty class for the time being, each containing an anchor. That's going to be our Skype one. Give that a class of Skype. Then we wanted a Twitter and a Facebook. There we go. So those are our links, and there's our copyright. I'll save that. Go and have a look in Chrome, see how we're doing. There we have our address details, second heading, our form button, copyright paragraph, and 3 social links. So that quite neatly, in fewer than 200 lines of markup, and that includes the head of our document, is our entire markup, which is great. And in fact some of that will actually be generated dynamically as well, so we'll be able to remove those soon too, which is fantastic. And we've done a good job of describing things as semantically as possible. Okay, it's time for some further reading. So let's just jump back into our presentation here. There we go. Firstly, for clarification on what semantics mean, have a look at this entry on Wikipedia. Then, for a more opinion-based article, see what Peter Gaston has to say on the importance of semantics on the web. This is a quick article in which he discusses aboutness. There's a new word for you. Lastly, for a solid reference on all the semantic elements currently available through HTML5, take a look at html5doctor.com. You'll also find a lot of discussion about how to use each element and what they mean. Now, before we jump into the next video, I have an assignment for you. I want you to finish off the HTML markup of our document as I just demonstrated. It's good practice for all we've been discussing about semantics. Next time on 30 Days to Your First Website Design, we're going to continue with our design by looking further into the CSS. I'm Ian Yates, and from all of us at Tuts Plus, thanks for watching.